ancient saga of the Vikings begins in their homeland, Scandinavia. The people of the north farmed, hunted, and fished. It was fishing that first brought the Norsemen to the water, and for centuries they used their seafaring skills for sustenance. But towards the latter part of the 8th century, the Norsemen gave up fishing and began to explore further afield. Scandinavia made an ideal base for buccaneers. The surrounding seas gave the Vikings easy access to the heart of neighboring continents, and so did their awe-inspiring ships. Viking ships were technological miracles, painstakingly developed by the Norsemen over nearly 10 centuries. The breakthrough came in the 7th century, when the Vikings invented the keel, raised a mast, and hoisted a sail. This boat is one of the many that have been recovered, yielding some of the Viking secrets about design and construction. Wedges were driven into freshly cut trees until they split along the grain. These planks kept their shape whether wet or dry. Then they were planed smooth until the boards fit perfectly together in a clinker construction, overlapping as in a fan. As many as 20 great oaks were felled for such a boat. The hull was watertight, thanks to a coating of animal hair soaked in tar. It was stabilized with iron rivets. Art was as important as craft. Carved dragon heads kept evil spirits at bay. Art permeated every aspect of Viking life. Even small everyday items such as combs were embellished with symbols, icons, and runes, the letters of the Viking alphabet. Runes were designed to be carved with a knife on wood. The runes have their own characteristic shapes. Curves were avoided because they were hard to cut. So were horizontal lines that might blend in with the wood grain, muddling the message. Although the runic characters were originally designed for cutting on wood, they were soon adapted for other materials. Consequently, there are many surviving examples of runic inscriptions on stone, metal, and bone. Those examples have opened doors to many mysteries. But science is slowly unmasking some of the mysteries surrounding the Vikings. In Germany, at the Institute for Judicial Medicine, University of Bonn, criminal forensic technology has found a new application, uncovering information about life in the Middle Ages. This Viking's teeth indicate he was a veritable senior citizen of his era, 45 years old. He died of a skull injury. The storerooms of the Viking Museum of Schleswig hold the remains of innumerable Vikings. The bones in these boxes are disassembled puzzle pieces that help form a picture of the Vikings' appearance and health. 1,000 years ago, this arm was struck by a powerful blow from a sword. The deep wound healed poorly. Evidently, medical care scarcely existed for the early Vikings. Infant mortality was high, and the average adult lifespan short. Although cavities are seldom found in Viking skeletons, this person's rotten tooth ate right through his jawbone, causing him excruciating pain for years. The Norsemen bore hardships, but they would soon become the embodiment of invincibility. At the end of the 8th century, the strong but isolated Norsemen became marauding Vikings, crisscrossing the seas to new lands. In wave after wave of attacks on monasteries, castles, and towns, the Vikings pummeled the coasts of England and France. The Vikings cleverly exploited the element of surprise, and some of their bloodiest invasions took place on feast days or during religious events. Within a few decades, the world had come to fear an ominous horizon, the red sails and dragon heads of the Vikings' fleet. The 300-year Viking reign of terror left few without battle scars. While groups of Vikings were settling in the British Isles, other Vikings sought their fortunes in another part of the world, into the uncharted lands of Viking legend. Sometimes the hunger for more open spaces provided the motivation to set sail. Other times the catalyst would be domestic conflict. After Viking Anderson killed the sons of an influential rival, he fled 1,500 kilometers northwest into the Atlantic, where he had heard rumors of a land where butter dripped from the grass. The climate had been growing milder for several centuries, which meant the thick ice that had once covered the whole of northern Europe was now receding, opening up new waterways and exposing new lands. Anderson and a couple of dozen settlers reached Iceland in the year 870. The first vistas of their hoped-for homeland were undoubtedly daunting. Two-thirds of the barren terrain consisted of lava and glacier. The climate was raw and winters were long and dark. The arrival of the Vikings frightened off Iceland's existing residents, Irish Christians. With typical Viking fortitude, Anderson's band settled in small valleys at the foot of lava mountains. An immense migration to Iceland meant 60 years after Anderson's beachhead, the population had grown to 30,000. Too many for the amount of fertile land. A wrenching famine in 970 was so severe that, according to one chronicler, the old and infirm were thrown over the cliffs. The lack of food and habitable land created a problem. The solution was to find more land elsewhere, farther across the North Sea. In 982, Viking Eric the Red left Iceland with 500 men, women, children, and their belongings across the waters to a land he named Greenland. It was a perilous journey. Out of 25 ships to leave, only 15 reached their destination. Nothing could have been further from their expectations. Greenland sprawls almost entirely within the Arctic Circle. Then, as now, the climate forbids agriculture. There was a dearth of basic necessities, too much iron and too little workable timber. Survival came to depend on trade with Scandinavia, back across the sea. By the year 1000, the population was estimated at 3,000 people living on 300 or 400 farms. This small community of Vikings endured for 500 years before disappearing forever. In the cold cellar of the Copenhagen Geophysical Institute in Denmark, history is stored at -60 degrees Celsius. Each of these tubes holds a core sample of Greenland ice. Like the rings of a tree, sheet upon sheet of ice has been layered over time. Answers to many questions about climatic situations are discovered by studying the appropriate section of the ice specimen. To the naked eye, one crushed ice cube differs little from another. By atomically dissecting the ice, extremes and seasonal variations in precipitation are revealed. In this apparatus, the heavy oxygen isotopes found in the water are counted. When their number is great, a warm climate is indicated. This spectrograph evaluates over 200 samples simultaneously. A complicated series of calculations presents a temperature profile and provides the clues about how a flourishing Viking colony collapsed after 5 centuries. Greenland's climate was milder around the year 1000 than it is today. 300 years later, the area suffered a sudden cooling down. In the temperature curve, this fatal blip is easy to decipher. In 992, the son of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, left Greenland with 35 men in search of new territory. Erikson was an exceptional sailor and had gained fame for opening up the most daring trade route between Greenland, Scotland, and Norway, sailing almost 3,000 kilometers without seeing land. Then he set sail for the west. Erikson and his men eventually reached green and leafy coasts. a fitting description many believe of North America. Ericsson's band returned to Greenland, and perhaps their tales of mild climate and fertile soil inspired more legendary voyages to the New World. Where they went and how they got there is still part of the Viking intrigue, the inspiration for centuries of study and speculation. But scholars have pondered a more practical question. Not if the Vikings reached foreign lands, but how they did so, out of sight of land. One answer may reside in the Danish National Museum in Copenhagen. Here, a tiny item in a collection of small archaeological finds is the center of a new Viking dispute, this time an academic one. Some scientists believe this fragment of wood is an ordinary button. Others insist these markings are of much greater significance, believing they represent sun positions by which the ship's position at sea can be determined. If this theory is true, the Viking Age navigator had a sun compass to find his way across the North Atlantic when he was out of sight of land. There is still scientific conflict of whether that device actually existed and was used by the Vikings. In 1889, a Minnesota farmer named Olaf Oman dug up a large flat stone entangled in the roots of a tree. As Oman's son brushed the soil off the rock, he noticed stick-like characters etched on it. Immediately recognized as runic inscription, the rock was dubbed the Kensington Stone after its location and put on public display. It attracted the attention of several scholars, including one from the University of Minnesota, who was able to translate the Viking runes.
8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on exploration journey from Finland westward. We had camp by 2 rocky islets, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out and fished one day. After we came home, found 10 men red with blood and dead. Have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships, 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362.
Archaeologists strongly doubted the stone's veracity, but the Kensington Stone became a major ethnic symbol for at least 50 years. Scandinavian immigrants who were proud of their heritage and anxious to make an early American connection wanted to believe in its authenticity. Documents from Oman's estate, housed at the Minnesota National Archives, such as these newspaper clippings, showed how much he enjoyed the fame and how well this allegedly illiterate man knew his Scandinavian history. He owned a multi-volume set of textbooks which included the runic alphabet. In handwritten notes, he described the fairy tale-like setting of the place of the stone's discovery. But the pièce de résistance? Oman was a Swedish immigrant who had learned the trade of stone carver in Sweden. The Kensington Stone is perhaps the most disappointing rune forgery because it is the most ingenious. The only items discovered in the New World which have a legitimate claim to be Viking relics aren't even on the American continent today. And like their many ancestors, these relics withhold as many secrets as they divulge. A bit of copper, a worked-on piece of bark. These are the last vestiges of a Viking settlement in the region. Then there is this walnut, which was unearthed in Newfoundland in America, but cannot have grown here. Interestingly, a bronze Nordic clothing pin, which very possibly could have been made by Viking hands, since the Native Americans did not know the craft of metal working with charcoal. The pin may have been made on this spot called Lancy Meadows. In this basin, other metal parts have been found, such as iron nails that bound the planking on ships. Viking ships. Whether used to explore the New World or to pillage the Old, the ships were a critical element of the Viking success. They were also the reason for another Viking conquest, long-distance trade. By the end of the 10th century, Viking merchants operated along a network of trade routes that stretched from Iceland to the Caspian Sea. Viking settlements became world trade centers. One example is Hedeby in Germany, on the coast of the Baltic Sea. Hedeby was founded at the beginning of the 9th century a small village protected only on one side by the sea. But it grew quickly. Within 125 years, it covered an area of more than 65 acres, and its population was over 1,000. A river served as both sewer and industrial stream. Life in Hedeby focused on trade, and it was here the first Viking coins were minted. The silver pieces featured representations of ships and were known as silent coins because they featured no place or mint year. A typical Hedeby house measured 5 by 17 meters. Families were extended and included concubines, servants, and slaves. The interiors were simple and functional. The central room served both as kitchen and living room. It had benches against the walls. There were no windows except for the opening in the ceiling above the open hearth. Hedeby was the crossroads of international commerce and was a highly unusual place for its time. Unusual because peace reigned year-round. Equally rare, there was religious tolerance as Christians and pagans lived and worked side by side. There were no armed engagements, just trading. Today, the ramparts which stood watch over the town are camouflaged in greenery. The once swarming metropolis is now a massive graveyard. Archaeologists are akin to scientific grave diggers. Instead of a spade, they use a geomagnetic data logger, a system which measures the magnetic properties of the ground. Every alteration in the earth, whether it's caused by old beams or broken bowls, is picked up and stored electronically. From this data, scientists create a ground profile charted to the exact centimeter. Underground plotting is a meticulous process. A georadar shows the soil structure in even greater detail. The objects themselves remain undisturbed, preserved by Earth. The accumulating data is stored and cross-referenced, enabling the computer to recreate a Hedeby city map. Back in the laboratory, the new discoveries materialize on screen. Slowly, houses and streets of the buried town are resurrected electronically. But much of Hedeby now lies underwater. Since the Viking Age, the Baltic has risen more than 11 meters, creating excellent conditions for the preservation of wood and other organic materials beneath it. Researchers are especially fascinated with Hedeby's renowned sea wall, a massive structure erected in the 8th century. Now there's only one way to get a glimpse of the once intimidating barricade. Lowered into the water, the sonar's highly sensitive position finder scans the surface of the muddy harbour bottom. A sediment sonar is fastened to the ship's side. Its sound waves ricochet against the floor of the sea and produce photographic quality pictures of artifacts ensnared in the muck. 1,300-year-old relics are clearly recognizable on the screen. Underwater archaeology is a relatively new discipline. The waterlogged conditions of Hedeby Harbour are exceptionally good for the preservation of items that don't normally survive the passage of time. The diver's assignment today, to exhume part of the sea wall. His challenge? Choppy waters and a muddy sea floor. The combination renders underwater visibility almost impossible. Virtually blind, the diver must feel for his quarry, a 1,000-year-old beam. For archaeologists, wood can be a treasure trove of information. These planks are part of a magnificent Viking ship, which archaeologists recovered from Hedeby's slimy depths. Charred wood along the ship's side proves a vital clue in reconstructing the story of Hedeby's demise. Captured by the city's attackers, The ship was loaded with flammable materials and set afire. Then, like a giant Molotov cocktail, it was launched against Hedeby's palisade. The city became an inferno and a memory. Whether or not Vikings set foot in America, one thing is certain. In places such as Hedeby, the Vikings truly discovered a new world. A world of trade, of peaceful coexistence. Victories on the battlefield were exchanged for success and commerce. Nations were born. Ironically, at the very moment their culture blossomed, they ceased to exist, and the Vikings became Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, English, or French. What remains of them today are remnants and riddles and runic sagas, pirate poets, warrior artists, ghosts. The Vikings elude us still.
Vikings. The word calls up images of giants, grim warriors and fearless sailors capable of bravery and barbarism in equal measure. They hailed from the Scandinavian countries now known as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The bleak, mountainous interiors of their homelands made them an outward-looking people from the start. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, they began pushing their longboats out from the fjords, scanning the horizons for precious land and sources of trade, and terrorizing the hapless Europeans who stood in their way. For more than 500 years, they swept into Europe, east, south, and west. The westward-looking Norwegians would move stepwise across the Atlantic, from the British Isles to Iceland, to Greenland, and finally to a mysterious place called Vinland, somewhere in America. Every schoolchild knows that the rogue Viking Leif Erikson set foot in the New World long before Columbus's historic voyage. But until recently, just how the Scandinavians managed this navigational feat remained a mystery. The questions persist. Did they try to colonize the Americas? And how much of their seafaring skill did they bequeath to medieval Europe?
The more I've sailed in these small, after all small and open ships, the more respect I have gotten for these people. They were extremely brave. They must have been very, very clever shipbuilders, sailors, navigators. They must have been very well organized, and I mean, they were fantastic.
Ragnar Thorseth, adventurer from Norway, knows the seafaring ways of the Vikings as intimately as anyone. For the last decade, Thorseth had dedicated himself to building replicas of Viking ships and sailing them round the world.
What we have been interested in is to learn as much as possible about the ship, seaworthiness, speed, and of course to learn how to sail them, so that we better can understand how it was possible for the Vikings to not only to sail once across the North Atlantic, but to cross it regularly 1,000 years ago.
The archaeology of boats is a relatively new frontier in the science of the past. Working with scholars from the Viking ship museums in Norway and Denmark, Ragnar has tried to remain as faithful to the original Viking shipbuilding craft as possible.
What is unique for Scandinavian shipbuilding at that time is the clink building technique. Most ships today the planks are like this, but the Viking ships, it's more like this, and then they are nailed together. And first you build up the ships with the planking, and then later on you put in the ribs, while in most other traditions they do it the opposite way.
Thorseth's fleet consists of replicas of 3 ships: Gaia, a copy of the largest Viking ship yet found, built in 850 AD as a raiding vessel and probably once the property of a king. The Oseberg, a copy of a royal yacht dating from about 800 AD, is the most elegant of the Viking ships. The original was built for protected waters and never meant to see the high seas. The Saga Sigla, the most seaworthy of the three vessels, is an 11th century Viking trader.
Well, if I were to cross the North Atlantic again, I would go for the Saga Sigla, the Knar. But if I were to compete in America's Cup, I would go for the Gaia. Beautiful, fast ship, really.
The story of the Vikings' expansion is intimately connected to the characteristics of the land they inhabited, the conditions that drove them outwards. Europe was helpless against the pagan horde. Wielding axes and swords with gruesome skill, the Vikings knew no reason to spare civilians, women, and children from their attacks. They ventured as far south as Spain, perhaps even sailing occasionally into the Mediterranean. In the 9th century, they grew strong enough to sack London and lay siege to Paris. They settled parts of Ireland, northern England, and conquered the city of York.
Well, I think we've completely revolutionized people's idea of the Viking era in York. People used to think of the Vikings coming and just destroying the city. But we've seen a picture where they come and they inject new life into the place and they lay it out with the streets and the properties and the churches and the buildings, which you can still see today. The lines of the properties still exist 1,000 years after, but they have their origin in the Viking Age. So the Vikings came as traders and as merchants, and they gave York new economic life.
From there, they struck out ever westward. The Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland. In the process, they became learned seamen.
We are pretty sure that they were able to establish the latitude they were on, and that they would follow the latitude. We are pretty sure that they had a sun compass to help them establish the latitude. We also know that they were well familiar with the planets, with the stars. For instance, the polar star, they called that the leading star, so they would always know the true north. And of course, anytime when it was clear weather, they would have the sun and the moon and the other planets. The problems, I guess, came up when they for many days had bad weather and couldn't see the sky. Then they could get lost, and but that was actually a good thing too, because the first man to get a sight of Greenland, he was lost, and also the first man, according to the tradition at least, to get the sight of Vinland or America. He was in his way from Norway to Greenland, and he got lost in a storm, and so.
Our source for those westward journeys are two sagas, both of which tell of the volatile clan of Eric the Red. Theirs is a tale of discovery driven by violence and exile. Eric's father, exiled from Norway on charges of manslaughter, took his family to Iceland. Eric himself, exiled from Iceland after several fights and killings, set off in 986 to settle on the island of Greenland. Eventually, the colony would grow to several thousand settlers. It conducted brisk trade with Europe for several centuries.
Greenland was a rich country. It had many resources which Europe wanted in the medieval period. Things as prosaic as walrus hide, which were used for ships' ropes, through things as mysterious as narwhal tusk, which throughout medieval Europe was considered to be the unicorn horn, the horn of this sort of very mystical and mythical beast. The main commodity, however, was ivory. And walrus ivory from the tusks of the walrus that lived in more northerly waters of Greenland was the main form in which tributes and various tithes were paid to Europe by the Greenlanders.
The Vikings continued to look westward across the Atlantic. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, one Bjarni Herjolfsson was driven off course while trying to reach Greenland and sighted North America in 986. He did not go ashore, but he carried the knowledge of the continent back to Greenland. In about 1000, Eric the Red Sun, Leif, decided to strike out for the mysterious westward land to see if it might be suitable for colonization. According to the sagas, Leif's expedition first happened upon a barren landscape backdropped by mountains and glaciers. Leif dubbed the place Helund, or Land of Flat Rocks. Scholars believe this to be Baffin Island. Sailing southward, they then pulled ashore on a wooded place with a gently sloping shoreline and broad white beaches. This they named Markland, or Land of the Forest. It was probably Labrador.
Then to the south of that was a third land, which they called Vinland. And this is the one that the questions are about. We don't know exactly where Vinland was, except that it was somewhere to the south of Labrador.
For years, scholars have debated the truth of the sagas and the location of Vinland, even the meaning of the term Vinland.
Hann mælti þá á norrænu stund leið, var gengin eigi miklu lengra. He spoke then the Norse language and said, I have something new to tell you. I found wines and grapes.
The name Vinland was given to the land by Leif Erikson in the sagas because, as he said, because of the good qualities that it has. Now, this has been a controversy in scholarship ever since because people want to, in modern days, see it as V-I-N with an accent on the I, Vinland, meaning land of wine or land of grapevines. But in Leif Erikson's time, they really had no knowledge of grapevines or wine. There was an Old Norse word, V-I-N, without the accent, Vinland, which referred to pasture land. And in fact, any Norse explorer finding a new land would have had as his first priority to find pasture land. They lived on their cattle. They carried cattle with them in their ships as they went exploring. And their first priority was find a place for the cattle to graze.
Well, Norse people would settle in a land where the old pattern of culture fitted. I mean, in Newfoundland, they would find what they were used to, hunting seals, hunting caribou, and all that stuff. And furthermore, it was very important to stop in time, don't sail too long, because I lived in the wilds for many, many years in the northern part, and the preparations for the winter, on that depends life and death. They had to build houses, they had to hunt, had to fish, and prepare for the winter.
It was here, in northern Newfoundland, that the definitive evidence was finally found. Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Anna Stina Ingstad spent the better part of a decade sailing up and down the Atlantic coast of North America, looking for clues of the Vikings. In 1961, they arrived at Lance aux Meadows.
Dr. Ingstad is a Norwegian explorer, but his wife Anna Stina was the archaeologist. And they arrived in Lance aux Meadows by accident, really, and they met with the local spokesman of the community, Mr. George Decker. Dr. Ingstad asked Mr. Decker if there was anything unusual, any humps or bumps or mounds around, and Mr. Decker said, yes, there are some Indian campsites up by Black Duck Brook.
And there it was. Even if it was so overgrown as it was, and it was made very clear that it was remains of old houses. But we didn't know, of course, who had built these houses. There might have been Indians, there might have been Eskimos, there might have been fishermen, it might have been whalers, and at last it might have been Norsemen. Only excavation could tell the story. But personally, I had a strong feeling from my experience in Greenland and in western part of Norway that this was a place that the Norse people would like to build their homes.
The Viking presence on North American soil some 500 years before the voyages of Christopher Columbus has now been definitively established at Lanceau Meadows. How is it possible then that such a monumental discovery would gradually fade from memory, that by the time of Columbus the notion of sailing off the edge of the world would again lurk in the imaginations of European explorers? The answer? It probably didn't. In 1957, Yale University acquired a rather stunning map dating from the mid-1400s. On its western extremity appears the island of Vinland. 400 years after life's journey, and 50 before Columbus's. If authentic, the map proves that the reality of transatlantic crossing was still present in the minds of Europeans.
Part of the controversy about the Vinland map is the question of its provenance. There are speculations that it did actually come from a Spanish library in a private family library that was perhaps trying to avoid the Spanish regulation on exporting antiquities.
Indeed, the map raised such intriguing questions that several scholars sought a simpler answer. It was a forgery. And close examination revealed that the ink on the document contained titanium oxide, a chemical available only in the 20th century.
But I've shown a way that there could have been a transfer of this titanium dioxide into the ink in modern times as an accidental transfer during cleaning. In the mid-1950s, tissue paper of some manufacturer for a few years did contain commercial titanium dioxide, exactly the material that has been found in the map.
There is, however, reason to believe the map authentic. On the upper left-hand corner is inscribed a long secret message in code, a cryptogram.
The discovery of the cryptogram in the inscriptions of the Vinland map shows that someone went to an awful lot of trouble to incorporate these cryptograms in the inscription. One does not create a cryptogram hidden in an inscription except by an awful lot of very hard retrying work, and just one change of one word in this inscription could destroy the structure of the entire cryptogram. For a forger to go to all the effort to incorporate two cryptograms in two separate inscriptions in the map is very difficult for me to imagine.
If the map is indeed authentic, it testifies that the Vikings had lost nothing of their navigational skills in the years preceding the momentous voyages of Columbus.
Columbus did definitely know about the Vikings and their voyages to North America. Remember that Columbus was born less than 50 years after the last Viking ship sailed from Norway to Greenland. We also know that Columbus was in Bristol when he was a young sailor, and Bristol was an important harbor, and they had lots of ships sailing up to Iceland and also to Greenland. So the Viking voyages, it was a living tradition. Some people also, or some science also say that Columbus went to Iceland, so he most definitely knew that there were land on the other side of the big ocean.
Greenlanders discovered or sailed to America. Greenland was colonized from Iceland, and so when we think America being found by Europeans, there were mainly Greenlanders who sailed from Greenland to the continent of America. We don't speak of Christopher Columbus in this country.
The Indians were there a long time before both Columbus and the Vikings, so the Vikings were probably the first Europeans in North America, but I mean they were there for a short period. Columbus, of course, opened up America for the Europeans.
It is too easy in this day and age to forget the true magnitude of the Vikings' achievements, to underestimate the elemental forces they challenged. But Ragnar Thorseth is not likely to forget. In May 1992, the valiant trader, the Saga Sigla, and the elegant royal yacht Oseberg foundered in a sudden storm off the coast of Spain. Luckier than their Viking forebears, the crew survived to tell the tale and to build and sail Viking ships once again. What extraordinarily brave men they must have been, pushing their open longboats into the fjords of Scandinavia, setting sail for unknown, hostile lands. An epic saga in themselves, these voyages wrote a heroic prelude to the European age of discovery. Leaving one to ponder, will we ever know the extent of the debt that Columbus owed his Viking predecessors?